Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Broniatowski from George Washington University. David has a long background of interest in health and data science. His work in general takes a kind of decision theoretical perspective, which he applies to a number of crisis-like situations using a wide variety of data. He is well known for his work, particularly that he's done recently in the area of anti-vaxxing in social media. So with that, I give it over to David. David?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I am pleased to be here. And if there's one thing that I can sort of say is the take-home message from this presentation, it's that a lot of the disinformation and misinformation that we're seeing right now around the novel coronavirus really builds on trends that have been progressively unfolding over the past several years. And I want you to think about the vaccine discourse, in particular the pro-vaccine, vaccine proponents and vaccine opponents, as the canary in the coal mine. Because a lot of what we see in the vaccine discourse is now being massively amplified within the environment of the novel coronavirus. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of these systematic online distortions of public opinion. I'll start out with examples in the COVID-19 space, give examples in the vaccine space, and sort of go back and forth between these two. And I'm going to end with some insights from a theory called fuzzy trace theory that focuses on one possible approach to combat some of these distortions and what we can learn from leading psychological theories. So to get us started, I actually want to acknowledge the work, the funding for this work from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, 5-year R01 that's just wrapping up, as well as from the James S. and John L. Knight Foundation through the GW Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, which has been funding some of this work moving forward. So to set a little bit of context here, I want to point you to recent public testimony by Leah Gabrielle, who is the coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the US State Department. The US State Department is, among other things, concerned with online misinformation and disinformation around the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak. And in this recent testimony, Ms. Gabrielle focused on 3 countries in particular: Russia, China, and Iran, and their disinformation efforts. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start out talking a little bit about what some of the Global Engagement Center's concerns have been, and then I'm going to follow those up with what we've seen in the vaccine space and some of our own findings in the COVID-19 space. That will shed a little bit more nuance on these particular concerns. And then from there, we'll go to some of the domestic misinformation and disinformation in this area. So to start out with, within this particular hearing, Ms. Gabrielle pointed out that the full Russian ecosystem of official state media has been pushing multiple disinformation narratives, and the goal seems to be capitalizing on chaos and uncertainty from health scares, and that the Kremlin in particular is attempting to propagate disinformation in this context. So to give you a little bit of background on some of the work that's been done here before, one of the things that our own work has focused on is whether vaccines are a vector for Russian disinformation. We started this study by asking whether there were bots posting about vaccines more often than the average Twitter user. I'm sure you're all aware that there is a large number of social bots masquerading as legitimate human users on Twitter, but we wanted to know whether vaccination in particular was a vector for the misinformation that these bots were spreading. And we also wanted to know how trolls, in particular state-sponsored trolls, differed from bots, differed from humans in their use of social media, and in particular Twitter. So we looked at lots of different types of publicly identified bot and troll accounts. And we were able to do this analysis retrospectively on an archive of tweets about vaccines that we've been collecting since 2014 as part of our NIH-funded project. And so we were able to search through this stream of tweets for messages that came from known bots and trolls that were identified over the years. And then we were able to identify relative proportions of neutral pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine tweets in this data set, as well as to assign them bot scores using the botometer tool developed by Indiana University and our colleagues there. So long story short, what you're looking at over here on the left is a chart that looks at the relative likelihood that any particular account type might tweet about vaccines. So this line 1 over here is the average Twitter user, and this bin over here, this bucket corresponds to Russian trolls. And what we found was that Russian trolls from the IRA in particular were about 22 times more likely to tweet about vaccines than the average Twitter user. So this suggests already that vaccines and health-related misinformation and disinformation is one of the areas of interest that these trolls are focusing on. But it's obviously not just Russian trolls. We also saw activity by a group of bots identified by the Indiana University team as social bots that seem to be about roughly 7 or 8 times more likely to tweet about vaccines than the average Twitter user. And then finally, we also looked at a group of accounts identified already back in 2011 as content polluters that primarily spread spam and malware. And they were also significantly more likely than the average Twitter user to tweet about vaccines. So this led us to ask, what were their different approaches? How was it that trolls tweeted about vaccines, and how did that differ from bots? How did that differ from different types of bots, and how did that differ from humans in general? So what we did was we segmented accounts into 3 buckets using bot score percentages. We used humans, or what we assume to be humans, bot scores less than 20% as our baseline. And if you look at these numbers here, they tend to be predominantly not polarized and predominantly pro-vaccine. And we compared those to bots, or very clearly bots. So these are accounts in the upper fifth. These tended to be about half and half pro and anti-vaccine. Interestingly, it was the accounts in the middle that tended to be more polarized and more anti-vaccine, which suggests that these accounts may be cyborgs, or accounts that are harder to detect, not clearly bots, not clearly humans, that tended to be more anti-vaccine and more polarized. And this is supported by the fact that there were a bunch of accounts that we actually couldn't get bot score readings on that tended to be more anti-vaccine as well. And once you start diving in to the actual specific types of accounts, these Russian trolls tended to play both sides as well, as did some of the more sophisticated bots, whereas these sort of spammy content polluter bots tended to be predominantly anti-vaccine. So this suggests the existence of multiple strategies, where one strategy is really focused on getting spam out there, anti-vaccine spam in many cases, sales of natural cures, where people might question the safety and efficacy of vaccines relative to other things, versus accounts that seem to be more about playing both sides. And so to help us understand what these accounts were doing, we identified a hashtag, #VaccinateUS, that was uniquely associated with Russian trolls. And what you see over here are some examples of tweets that came from Russian trolls. The red ones are anti-vaccine, the green ones are pro-vaccine. And what really stands out here is that these are tweets that are really designed to promote discord. So over here we have some of your typical anti-vaccine tropes. Some of them are maybe a little bit more conspiracy oriented. Illuminati are behind it, don't get vaccines. Did you know that vaccines cause autism? There's a secret government database of vaccine damaged children. These are all seemingly intended to promote distrust of authoritative sources. But if you look into the pro-vaccine tweets, you see similar sorts of intent, even though the accounts themselves are promoting vaccination. So for example, vaccines are a parent's choice of the color of a little coffin. That's not a tweet that's about promoting vaccination. That's a tweet that's about promoting anger and promoting discord. So this was a sort of a technique that we uncovered back in 2018. And since then, a recent paper in the American Journal of Public Health by Walter et al. Further dove down into these tweets and found that a lot of these anti-vaccine and pro-vaccine accounts were actually trying to construct specific personas, masquerading as African Americans and masquerading as both pro-Trump and anti-Trump accounts, with the intent of trying to essentially promote a lot of discord around using vaccines as a wedge issue. So this notion of Russian tactics using health concerns to promote discord was very much on our mind when we started looking at the COVID-19 discourse. And what I'm showing you now are some novel findings that are currently under review at the link that you see below, openreview.net. And these are findings particularly pertaining to COVID-19, joined with my colleague Aylan Chalishkan at GW's Computer Science Department. And here what we did was we used a method that was initially designed to extract biases from large text corpora that associated the implicit association test with specific sets of words in these corpora. And the intent here was to look at a set of tweets that contained anti-Chinese hashtags that were nevertheless in English. And this was a database of tweets that we collected in March 2020. And if you go follow the link, you can see all of the inclusion criteria. And what we did was we wanted to know whether these anti-Chinese hashtags were associated with other national sorts of sentiments. And so what we did was we looked at specifically how Russia was represented in these anti-Chinese hashtags compared to China. And so as expected, China was associated with unpleasantness and panic. But unlike other countries in our data set, Russia was associated with calm and pleasantness. And so if you go sort of down the list here, COVID-AC refers to these anti-Chinese hashtags, and these are the findings that I just mentioned. A general set, a different data set of COVID-related tweets also had Russia as pleasant and China as unpleasant, and Russia as calm and China as panicked. But here the p-value and the effect size is really just borderline. And then if you look at sort of a general set of tweets, Russia is actually associated with unpleasantness, and China is associated with pleasantness. Russia is associated with panic, and China is associated with calm, as indicated by these negative effects over here. And so what we find here is that there's quite a reversal in this set of coronavirus-related anti-Chinese tweets, where Chinese tweets are associated with panic, and Russian tweets are associated with calm. So this doesn't obviously necessarily reflect an explicit Russian disinformation campaign. What it does suggest is that Russian tweets and pro-Russian discourse is in fact building on some of the existing social media trends that we see. And so that compared to China, Russia, at least at the time these data were collected, seemed to be advantageously positioned. And so this is something that allows for essentially a propaganda win by the Russian government in comparison. So what's going on in China? Well, the Global Engagement Center noted that they've monitored multiple different narratives out of China. One of them is malign disinformation that wants to blame the US for the source of the coronavirus. And the other is a Chinese effort to make it look like the Chinese Communist Party is handling this health crisis appropriately, as handling it well. And so one might ask, what might the potential efficacy of these sorts of narratives might be, and what might be the motivation for promoting these narratives? And here we want to dive in to some of the context of the public health discourse in China immediately preceding these sorts of disinformation campaigns. And here we go back to 2018, where in 2018 there was a report that came out that was promoted on a popular blog. The name of the report was The King of Vaccines. And this report demonstrated that the Chengcheng biotechnology company had manufactured a rabies vaccine that was ineffective. So for those of you who are sort of, keep up with vaccines, rabies vaccine is certainly not a standard childhood vaccine. It's something that you typically get only if you've been exposed to rabies. For example, if you've been bitten by an animal that you suspect has rabies. Nevertheless, this particular scandal, which questioned the efficacy, not the safety, but just the efficacy of these particular vaccines, went absolutely crazy on Chinese social media and Chinese media in general. And we analyzed the incident using data from Weibo, which is one of the largest Chinese microblogging platforms. People often call it the Chinese Twitter, but in fact it's larger than Twitter in its membership. And what our data suggests in a nutshell is that public trust in the Chinese government surrounding public health had already been eroding prior to the coronavirus outbreak, which actually creates the conditions for which the Chinese government may feel the need to deflect the blame to other sources. And so if we look at what's going on around this particular scandal, what we did was we segmented the Weibo data into 3 weeks, the week immediately before, the week during, and the week after the scandal broke. And then we also looked at the same topics 1 year later. So what we see over here is that immediately before the scandal, you see a relatively large proportion of people self-reporting having gotten vaccinated. What that means is essentially people saying, I took my kids to the doctor, they got vaccinated, they didn't even cry at all, I'm so proud of them. And then what we saw is that this trend progressively dropped off as the scandal unfolded, whereas tweets expressing doubt in how the government was handling, not tweets, but Weibo posts, expressing doubts in how the government was handling the crisis grew very quickly. And if you look at what happened a year later, we saw that the number of messages self-reporting vaccination experience actually came back larger, but these were now primarily negative, whereas before the scandal, they were primarily positive. So people previously, as I mentioned before, were talking about how proud they were of their kid for not crying, that sort of thing. Now, after the fact, people are saying, I got vaccinated, my kid got vaccinated, they have a rash, are they okay? Can I be sure that they're safe? So people are still getting vaccinated at this time, but they're expressing significant concerns, and specifically concerns about whether these vaccines may be harming them. And so this was the environment under which the particular outbreak that we saw arose. And this may help to explain a little bit why the Chinese government seems so focused on trying to deflect the blame from some of their existing narratives. And then finally, what I want to do now is I want to talk very briefly about Iran. One of the things that the State Department mentioned was that several news outlets affiliated with Iran have published false stories alleging that the US has weaponized the coronavirus. And one of the things that the State Department also pointed out in their briefing was that the Chinese, Russian, and Iranian governments have been sort of playing off each other. So for example, the Iranians might put out a story suggesting that the US weaponized the coronavirus, and then the Russians might then cite the Iranians as if they were a credible source, and then the Chinese might then cite the Russians. And so that the concern is that these narratives are merging. And one of the things that I want to discuss is what the story looks like on the ground for the average Iranian using Twitter, and why the Iranian government may be trying to put out the messages that it is. So this is actually a group of slides that my student, Pedram Hosseini, who is a native Persian speaker, a native Farsi speaker, I'm sorry, put together regarding what Persian users on Twitter are saying around the COVID-19. And so this is not just Iran, but also several countries in the region, including Afghanistan, where people speak Farsi in communities as their primary language. And so what we did over here is we started collecting data on March 12th, and we've been collecting this data going forward that contain a number of Persian hashtags. What you see over here are the Persian hashtags, and then on the left are the English translations. And then after cleaning these tweets and doing standard pre-processing, what we started to do just from the very beginning was looking at the number of tweets over time. And what you can see is that in general, the number of tweets in Persian discussing the coronavirus has been steadily declining. One of these dips over here is actually associated with the Persian New Year, where the culture actually promotes people visiting. And one of the caveats I want to mention here is that this is excluding retweets. Although people are still using the same hashtags over time, what we do see is a general decline in novel content regarding coronavirus in Iran. However, the number of confirmed cases is not decreasing. What you're looking at over here is data from the Iran Ministry of Health, supplemented by data from Johns Hopkins University, where there were gaps. And what you can see here is that it seems quite clear that the Iranian outbreak has not yet reached its peak. So the number of cases are still increasing quite quickly, but the number of tweets are declining. And so it's not yet clear what's going on here, but it seems to be, one interpretation might be that that the Iranian population is simply getting fatigued with discussion. And if we start looking at what are some of the topics here, we ran an LDA topic model over these Iranian tweets, and then these are just some examples of some of the topics that we uncovered. There's a lot of discussion on what's going on in New York. There is a lot of discussion about false cures, as one sees in the discourse across a lot of different countries. But then there are some very specific Iranian topics, including several anti-regime tweets. And Pedram tells me that anytime you see the word mullah, that is actually a term that within Iranian discourse is derogatory towards the regime. And so there's a lot of discussion within Iran that seems to suggest an anti-regime sentiment. There is a fair amount of discussion about Afghanistan as the outbreak there is starting to ramp up. And then there's a lot of tweets that express both negative and positive sentiment towards quarantine. There are other topics here, including the Persian New Year. Seems to be a large discussion about whether political prisoners in Iran should be released because people are concerned about their safety and whether the government is adequately providing for them. And then one of the themes that seems to come up a lot is satire directed towards the Iranian regime. And in this particular case, there is a fake story about the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that sort of makes fun of them for a claim that they have a special device that can detect the coronavirus. And sort of parallel to that, we see a lot of both anti-religious messages directed at the regime, and then pro-religious messages directed at Islam in general. And so a lot of these messages seem to suggest that among the general population, there is real distrust in the Iranian regime, which again may provide some background as to why the government is promoting messages that are intending to, or seem intended to, deflect the blame. And so the last thing I want to thing I just want to discuss really quickly here is an overview of the breakdown of Persian tweets. And here, what we did was we did a clustering analysis on tweets just collected during 2 days. And the real take-home message here is that there is quite a large subset of messages over here that are satire and jokes. And we need to do a deeper analysis here to see whether these satires indicate that people are maybe not taking the the outbreak itself as seriously, or whether the satire is satire that may be directed towards the government's response. And so that's where we're continuing to look as we move forward. And so having set the stage now for some of the foreign discourse, what I want to do is compare that to what we're seeing in the US. And so I'm not going to spend too much time over here on this notion of what we've seen in the past, but suffice it to say, there is a long history of the vaccine discourse in the US basically taking advantage of new topics and trying to explain otherwise unexplained mysterious events using existing narratives or existing tropes. So for example, when the Zika virus hit in 2016, we saw that in Brazil, people were associating the Zika symptoms not with a new virus, but rather with existing tropes. So for example, there was a report that alleged that the Zika microcephaly was not actually due to a new virus, but was due to pesticides that were made by Monsanto. And there are, of course, several problems with this story. One of them is that Monsanto doesn't make the particular pesticide. That pesticide doesn't cause that, outcome, but especially that there was a spurious correlation here. Obviously, you're going to have pesticides where you have a mosquito infestation. Another meme that was going around was actually blaming the DTaP, the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine for the microcephaly that we saw. And so one of the key insights over here is that the sorts of people that are promoting these sorts of modified narrative are people that previously had tweeted about vaccines, and predominantly people that had tweeted anti-vaccine messages before. So what we see going on is that there are these organized anti-vaccine campaigns, and that people are manipulating existing facts to fit a narrative. So this led us to ask, well, what does that narrative look like here in the US, and who might be behind it? And so we approached this from multiple different perspectives, one of which was we looked at who was responsible for buying anti-vaccine ads on Facebook when the Facebook ad archive became available. What we found was that two buyers, two organizations were responsible for more than half of the ads. 4 were responsible for more than 75%. The two major buyers were the World Mercury Project and Stop Mandatory Vaccinations. World Mercury Project is owned by a prominent politician and environmental activist who has a vaccine hesitancy platform. And Stop Mandatory Vaccination is owned by a California businessman who explicitly says in his funding disclosures that he uses some of these proceeds for his expenses. And we saw a lot more concentration among these anti-vaccine ads than among pro-vaccine ads. Among the pro-vaccine ads, the same number of ads, roughly speaking, were much more widely distributed. And in part, that's because pro-vaccine ads were at the time more likely to have been removed by Facebook for violations of terms of service. So this is an indication here that some of the anti-vaccine content was really being posted by people who really knew the ins and outs of the social media platforms. Whereas a lot of the pro-vaccine ad buyers were not so familiar with the terms of service on these platforms, and as a result, had their ads pulled. So we're seeing really quite well organized groups on the parts of these vaccine opponents. We did a little bit of a deeper dive, and this is work now that's currently under review. We downloaded data using CrowdTangle for academics and researchers from 204 Facebook pages over the span of 10 years. And we categorized these pages into different groups according to whether they primarily promoted vaccination. These were all vaccine opponent pages, but they categorized vaccines in different ways. Some of them were more concerned about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. Some of them categorized vaccines as a civil liberty, so things like vaccine choice, vaccine freedom. Others were more focused on conspiracy theories, etc. And what we see is that there were really 3 time periods that, or 3 time points that really changed the vaccine discourse. Where, here, January 2015 seems to correspond to the Disneyland measles outbreak. 2016 corresponds to the launch of Vaxxed, which was a movie that was directed by a discredited former physician who claims that vaccines cause autism. And then 2019 was a spate of measles outbreaks here in the United States. And what we see is that the civil liberties groups really saw a very large increase in content, especially after the launch of Vaxxed. It really separated itself from the rest of the herd. This was especially pronounced in groups that were associated with US states. So these are groups with names like Michigan for Vaccine Choice, or Northwest Florida anti-vaxxers, or stuff like that, which suggests that people are organizing potentially at the state level in order to make legislative mandates less restrictive. And so we have a lot more information on that that is currently under review, so please stay tuned. But this also serves to set the stage for what is currently going on around the novel coronavirus. Here are some pictures just from the last few days of various news headlines and protests. These are both protests against coronavirus lockdowns that nevertheless seem to have anti-vaccine discourse showing up. US law classifies vaccines as unsafe. That's a sign here that people are promoting. Here's a truck that says, "Jesus is my vaccine." This is not just restricted to the US. We see tropes where people are saying coronavirus vaccines will not be tested in Africa because there's concern based on anti-vaccine sentiment regarding people using Africans as test subjects. This is one of those false tropes, false conspiracy theories, that people use Africans as test subjects for Western vaccines. Now we're starting to see Africans actually engaging in political organization, in some cases violent behavior, in order to oppose coronavirus vaccine programs that haven't even started yet. So the opposition to a coronavirus vaccine has started, even though the vaccine, of course, is not yet available, which is a very similar trend to what we saw during the Zika outbreak. So what is it that vaccine opponents are saying specifically about coronavirus vaccine? Well, we actually identified the top 2,000 accounts in 2019 throughout the entire year that had spoken about vaccines. Of these, they were significantly more likely to oppose vaccination. 906 of them opposed vaccination, whereas only 506 of them supported it. And if we look at how we categorize these accounts, we had a group of annotators go through and label them. We see that the vaccine opponents tend to be more likely to discuss conservative conspiracies, conservative politics, and general conspiracies than the pro-vaccine accounts. Pro-vaccine accounts tended to be people who identified themselves as doctors and researchers or health organizations, and slightly more likely to discuss liberal politics. And so the question now becomes, what is it exactly that they're saying? And so among the vaccine opponents, we divided these accounts into the categories that we mentioned. Conservative conspiracy accounts really started talking about how the coronavirus really wasn't as bad as other diseases like the flu, but also discussed things like generalized Chinese oppression, stories about how the Chinese are shooting people in the streets, which are of course untrue, and then the Gates conspiracy theory that alleged that the coronavirus was created by and predicted by the Gates Foundation. Within conservative politics in general, we saw a very similar top two tweets, but then more discussion of this bioweapon conspiracy, the notion that the coronavirus was created in a lab in Wuhan, which was similarly reported in general conspiracy theories. In contrast, liberal vaccine opponents tended to make similar disease comparisons and discuss Chinese oppression, but focused more on pharmaceutical malfeasance rather than specifically the Gates Foundation. They were much more opposed to big pharma. Among those accounts that were really vaccine-focused accounts, we saw some discussion of natural cures as well. In contrast, among vaccine proponents, we saw much more of an emphasis on this notion of facts, not fear. People were discussing the need to not sort of freak out about the coronavirus, as well as more discussion about background information and attempts to discuss the etiology of the coronavirus. Within accounts that discuss vaccines in general, we also saw some discussion and concerns about anti-Chinese racism. So this actually allows us to look in more depth into this notion of how different types of accounts construct their stories about the coronavirus. What we found was that there was misinformation on the anti-vaccine side, but also misinformation on the pro-vaccine side. And what you're looking at here is a common Kermit the Frog meme that was spreading in pro-vaccine circles. That says more people have died from the flu this year than have been infected with coronavirus, but so many people still won't get a flu shot. And this is just an indication that when you're dealing with a scenario that has a high degree of uncertainty and where the facts themselves are easily decontextualized, not all misinformation will necessarily appear as conspiracy theories. Decontextualized facts can also be quite harmful because they might motivate people to not take the disease itself as seriously. You know, people may simply say, well, it's just a bad flu. And in their sort of well-intentioned aims to get people to increase flu vaccination, and indeed this year's flu was worse than previous years, what ends up happening is people may end up taking their eye off the ball. So the key insight here is that people are, regardless of where they're coming from, are taking existing facts about this coronavirus and fitting them into their existing narratives. And this is something that was sort of already discussed back in 2012 in a special issue of the journal Vaccine, mentioning that these narratives tend to make vaccine messages compelling because they're easy to understand, concrete, and credible, and they essentially give people a framework with which to understand what they're looking at. So we wanted to understand the dynamics of these narratives, and we did that through the use of a rather widespread psychological theory of decision under risk, one of the top theories in that area, known as fuzzy trace theory. And fuzzy trace theory says that people encode multiple representations of a stimulus, such as a social media message, in parallel, where there's the verbatim representation, the statistical details, which is kind of just the facts. This is the facts, not fear, that people are talking about in the context of the pro-vaccine tweets. But then there's the gist, or the bottom line meaning. The bottom line meaning, at its best, can communicate what it is that, that people really should be concluding from this information. For example, taking any risk that your child could get the measles isn't worth it. Vaccination is the best way to protect your child. According to fuzzy trace theory, stories are going to be effective if they communicate a gist. And that's because they cue motivationally relevant moral and social principles. They give people, in a sense, a framework that they can then connect to values that they hold in long-term memory. And we examined this theory in the context of the Disneyland measles outbreak, which, as I mentioned before, really kicked vaccine opposition into the political mainstream in the US. And we tested whether articles on Facebook that contained a gist were more likely to be shared than articles that didn't. And so for some examples of articles containing a gist, here's an example of an article that did. Basically said opting out of a vaccination is, quote, a recipe for an outbreak. It communicates a very clear bottom line. Here's an anti-vaccine message that also communicates a relatively clear gist. Militant Australian vaccine fluoride fanatics seek to eliminate all forms of free speech. Very clear message about how the fanatical government is trying to infringe on our freedoms. On the other hand, these were two articles where the people annotating really couldn't figure out what exactly the bottom line was. So here, is Clinton's medical advisor an anti-vaccine activist? And so then the question is, so what, right? Or the US government caught freezing a vaccine petition regarding people to have own free choice. So already, it's not quite clear what they're talking about. And if you go into the article, it basically says, well, the number of people who responded to this petition stayed constant for a certain amount of time. So it must be that the government was freezing the petition to make it look like the petition was. It was a sort of a really convoluted story that didn't really make a lot of sense. And so that was tagged as not really having a gist. And so according to fuzzy trace theory, gist is really the engine that drives the virality of online sharing. And our results are quite consistent with that theory. We found that articles containing a gist were about 2.3 times more likely to be shared at least once. Interestingly, articles containing statistics were also more likely to be shared at least once, which is consistent with fuzzy trace theory's prediction about multiple levels of representation. So statistics do matter. They simply don't matter as much. Interestingly, there was no effect of stories once you accounted for gist and statistics. And then we also looked at articles that were shared more than once. And the only thing that predicted whether an article was shared more than once was gist. So statistics didn't matter, stories didn't matter. Articles with a gist were shared about 2.4 times more often on average than articles without gists. And interestingly, articles that expressed both sides and then told you the bottom line meaning, those were shared on average 58 times more often. So we might ask, why are these narratives compelling? Well, according to fuzzy trace theory, gist connects the dots. It gives you a causally coherent and meaningful story or bottom line meaning that explains otherwise meaningless events. So this notion of spurious correlation that anti-vaxxers have drawn on, for example, in the case of Zika, this idea that, well, it wasn't the mosquitoes, it was the larvicide, actually answers a meaning threat. It gives people a meaningful framework that is in accordance with their values that allows them to attribute otherwise mysterious events. And this notion of causality is something that we also explored in more detail. We collected 10,000 tweets about vaccines between 2014 and 2017. And we identified a topic within these tweets that specifically corresponded to a causal gist. As indicated here by these words, cause autism, vaccines cause. This is about vaccines causing autism, obviously. And our prediction was that topics expressing this causal gist would be more likely to be shared than other topics, including this topic down here that says vaccines, autism, science, CDC whistleblower, and vaccines autism. So this other topic asserts a vaccine autism link, but doesn't give you a causal connection. So we did a similar kind of analysis, and long story short, we once again found a difference between 0 versus 1 retweet or 0 versus 1 share and 1 versus many. So among the factors that led to things getting at least 1 share was the vaccine autism link and this topic that was about statistics or verbatim information, okay? Whereas if we look at the factors that led to multiple shares, given that it had been shared once, there were only 2 topics that mattered. One of them was vaccines cause autism. The other one was pet vaccines, which is in itself a pretty robust finding. Things involving pets tend to go viral. But interestingly, the topic pertaining to vaccines causing autism was less effective when it contained verbatim information. So it was more effective when it had a clear bottom line meaning and didn't try to get into the weeds of some of that verbatim content. So the implications here are that fuzzy trace theory's predictions actually replicate across multiple platforms, and they give us guidance for how we might better communicate the risks and the benefits to vulnerable audiences, including in the context of COVID-19. Facts do matter, but the effect size is small. And so that really emphasizes the need to communicate the gist, communicate the bottom line meaning, which really comes down to, in a sense, understanding the values of the community to which you want to communicate, targeting and tailoring, and then communicating the bottom line in a way that that particular community is going to find consonant with their moral and social values. So the conclusion here is that the social media landscape has really quite a range of automated and sincere account holders, and that these may have a range of hidden agendas. State-sponsored trolling obviously differs significantly between the states that are involved, and the motivations for promoting disinformation may be better informed by sort of understanding what's going on the ground in those own countries. But then, of course, there are also genuine believers. Some of these genuine believers may be taken advantage of by those that want to promote alternative products and other pecuniary interests. And some of them may be trying to take advantage of others. The bottom line here is that this is a swiftly changing landscape. And as a public health communicator, we really need to be able to adapt to it. And I think that there's a lot that we can get out of leading theories that suggest very promising areas for how we might try to combat some of these more harmful messages. And with that, I am happy to open the floor to questions.
Hello, David?
Yes.
I wasn't totally off mute, sorry. My question to you was simply that you mentioned that some of the advertisements were funded, and that there were two different groups that were funding most of the advertisements. How did you find out who was funding what?
So within the Facebook ad library, people disclose the ads have to disclose their funding source. And in fact, that's one of the things that some of the vaccine opponents, in a sense, did better than the vaccine proponents. The pro-vaccine ads, often coming from state-level public health agencies, neglected to mention who their funding source was. And Facebook's terms of service at the time, I'm not sure if they've changed since then, Facebook terms of service at the time indicated that anytime somebody launches a political ad, they have to state what their funding source is. Now, my guess is that the state-level public health agencies didn't realize that Facebook considered pro-vaccine vaccination campaigns as political ads, and so the ads got pulled. But generally speaking, Facebook does require that people disclose their sources, and these two particular groups are not shy about attributing their ads to themselves.
Hello, David.
Yes.
So you, the decision about whether something contains a gist or not was done by human annotators, is that right?
It was done, so yes, in the Facebook study, we had a group of people on MTurk actually do those annotations.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit more about how you explained to MTurkers what a gist was and how to find one?
Yes, so what we did was we actually did, we did 2 rounds and we tested concordance between those. We asked people to indicate whether the article communicated a bottom line meaning or suggestion for action. And that was a yes or no question. And then we also asked people to indicate whether articles had a clear opinion indicating a pro-vaccine, well, it's actually pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine orientation. And what we found was that pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination, what we found was that these two things overlapped quite heavily. And so when things, when people annotated content as having a clear bottom line meaning, that's what we called a gist in our analysis.
And your inter-annotator agreement within the groups was pretty high?
I believe, yes, it was relatively high. The specific number, I want to say was a Cohen's kappa of something like 0.5, but don't quote me on that. I have it back in the paper. I can go back and look. It's one of those scenarios where even if the inter-annotator agreement was low, the effect size was high enough to sort of make the case that given even noisy data, we have a pretty clear effect.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, David, Aman here. So I just wanted a quick question about the 2,000 people who are talking about vaccine. So are you talking about 2,000 people who are just generally talking about vaccine, or are talking about vaccine and the virus or is it something else?
So what we did was we identified in our vaccine stream, which is a set of tweets collected since 2014 that have mentions of vaccines or vaccine preventable illnesses. We identified within that stream all tweets that had the word vaccine in it. And then we looked at which users were most frequently represented in the year 2019. And we identified the top 2,000 users. So I believe that the least popular, so the 2,000th most popular user, had something like 124 tweets about vaccines. And then the top one was well into the 70,000s.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, David. Giovanni here. My question was, have you tested if the novelty of a message could also explain the number of shares? For example, if this was a new meme that nobody had posted before?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's obviously the paper by Vasovi and colleagues that was published in Science recently that claims that novelty was responsible for virality. And then interestingly enough, there is work by David Rand's group at MIT that looks at the illusory truth effect that claims that perceptions of plausibility are associated with repeated exposure. And so we actually have these sort of two competing hypotheses, one that says novelty works and the other says that repetition works. You know, neither of those were things that we explicitly controlled for in our study. However, in the Twitter study that we mentioned before, we did do a secondary analysis where we looked at expressions of surprise and other emotional content that were similar to what Vosugi did in his paper, and what we found was that it didn't have any predictive accuracy. So we were not able to replicate those results. However, he was dealing with Firehose data where he was able to explicitly look at mentions of new memes, whereas we were looking at where they were expressing surprise. So it's not you know, it's not a methodological replication. It's more of a construct level replication. It's certainly something that I think requires deeper analysis.
Great, thank you.
David, Kathleen again. So in the work that you're doing, what do you see? You know, a lot of this is being shown as storylines. My question is, can you get to the point, or are you going to get to the point of being able to measure the number of times each of these storylines are present, and how much they're and what their reach is?
Yeah. So the question that's a great question, and you know, from a sort of a measurement standpoint, this really comes down to the question of how do we know if two things have the same gist? And it's complicated by the fact that there's the stimulus, which is something that we can measure computationally, versus how people interpret the stimulus, which is something that may be a little bit more difficult for us to get our hands on in an observational way. I do think that that we have we do have ongoing work actually that we're sort of just spinning up right now on trying to develop survey techniques to validate whether computational measures of gist are actually consonant with what people are measuring online, but it's still relatively early on, and being able to extract what the person who's looking at the social media message is interpreting from it seems like something that would probably require an experimental arm and also an observational arm. And so that's, if there are any program officers on this call who are really interested in funding that, I'm all ears. But that's actually quite a large study that I nevertheless think is absolutely, I nevertheless think is absolutely critical to be able to nail this down.
Hey, David, just a follow-up on that. So your mechanical Turkers just said whether they could see a clear bottom line meaning. Did you do any pilots where you asked them what the bottom line meaning was?
Not in that particular study. Well, what we did do was we asked them whether the bottom line meaning was a pro. So this gets a little complicated. We asked them to indicate whether it was in favor of pro-vaxxers, opposed to pro-vaxxers, in favor of anti-vaxxers, or opposed to anti-vaxxers. We didn't get them to give us a free response.
Right.
That's something that we do intend to do in future work. And so again, what we're basically relying on for these findings is that the GIST, GIST across these different studies was measured in different ways. So the GIST used the, in the MTurk study used the technique that I mentioned. In the Twitter study, we looked for that indication of causality. And then, of course, all of this builds on 30 years worth of experimental studies on fuzzy trace theory that have been applied to domains as diverse as metaphor comprehension, to legal reasoning, to sexual risk taking, to product labeling. All of which have very different ways of measuring the same construct. I've personally done work on measuring this using sort of typical survey techniques where the pre-response is actually maps the survey items very, very well in the antibiotics domain. But again, that's the sort of thing where I think would be absolutely required in an experimental arm that would then have to be scaled up using some general machine learning techniques to the social media domain. So you're absolutely right that creating the linkage between the construct and the measurement is really the frontier here.
Okay, we've hit our bewitching hour. Anyway, David, I want to thank you very, very, very much. It was really, really terrific, and I look forward to reading and hearing more in the future from you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.